everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Something Dark. Thank you for joining me this evening, and let's get into tonight's case. On April 20th, 1999, in Columbine, Colorado, a high school massacre took place. The perpetrators, two 12th grade students, murdered 12 students and one teacher. 21 additional people were injured by gunshots, and gunfire was also exchanged with police. Another 3 people were injured trying to escape the carnage. The 2 murderers ended their killing spree in the school's library, where the pair committed suicide. At that time, it was the deadliest school shooting in US history, and this crime has inspired several copycat attacks. Tonight we're going to be discussing the case of the Columbine High School Massacre and the 2 shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Eric David Harris was born on April 9th, 1981, in Wichita, Kansas. His parents were both born and raised in Colorado. His father was working in the United States Air Force as a transport pilot, which forced the family to move around the country sporadically. In 1983, the family moved to Dayton, Ohio. 6 years later, the family relocated to Oscoda, Michigan. The Harris family moved to Plattsburgh, New York in 1992, then to Colorado the next year, when Eric's dad retired from the military. Kyle Ross, a former classmate of Eric, said that he was just a typical kid. On a 1997 English class assignment, Eric wrote about how difficult the move from New York to Colorado was. "It was the hardest thing moving from Plattsburgh. I have the most memories there." Eric continued, "When I left my friends, I felt alone. I felt lost and even agitated that I had spent so much time with them, and now I have to go because of something I can't stop." Eric blamed his father for moving the family around, forcing Eric to start out at the bottom of the ladder. While Eric was in 7th grade, he met Dylan Klebold. In 1996, the Harris family purchased and settled at a house south of Columbine High School. Eric entered Columbine High School in 1995 as a freshman. Columbine had just gone through a major renovation and expansion. From all accounts, he had many friends and was left forward and midfield on the Columbine soccer team for his freshman and sophomore year. According to one of his teammates, Josh Swanson, he said that Eric was a solid soccer player who enjoyed the sport a lot. Eric, during his freshman year, met Tiffany Teifer, who was in his German class. She later recounted that Eric quickly wooed her. Eric asked her to homecoming, and she accepted. After the event, it appeared that she was no longer interested in seeing Eric anymore, for reasons never disclosed. When she refused to socialize with Eric again, he staged a fake suicide, sprawling on the ground with fake blood splash all over him. When she saw him, she began to scream for help, at which point Eric and his friends began laughing, prompting her to storm off, shouting at Eric to get psychological help. Dylan Klebold was born on September 11th, 1981, in Lakewood, Colorado. According to reports, Dylan was exceptionally bright as a young child, although he appeared somewhat sheltered in elementary school, and when he transitioned to middle school, he found it difficult. Dylan's parents were unconcerned with the fact that Dylan had found changing of schools uneasy, as they assumed it was just regular behavior amongst young adolescents. In 1996, 15-year-old Eric Harris created a private website on AOL. It was initially intended to host the first-person shooter video games Doom and Doom 2, as well as Quake, but on the site, Eric began a blog, which included jokes, his thoughts on his family, friends, and school. It also detailed Eric sneaking out of the house to cause mischief and vandalism, such as lighting fireworks with his friend Dylan Klebold and others. Beginning in early 1997, the blog postings began to show the first signs of Eric's anger against society. By the end of the year, the site contained instructions on how to make explosives. Eric wrote, "The first 2 pipe bombs created entirely from scratch. Now our only problem is to find a place that will be ground zero." Eric's site attracted few visitors and caused no concern until August 1997. Eric ended a blog post detailing murderous fantasies with, "All I want to do is kill and injure as many of you as I can, especially a few people like Brooks Brown," who was a classmate of his. Brooks claimed that Dillon gave him the website address in an effort to warn him of Eric's threats of violence against him. Others suggest it was in fact discovered by Brooks's older brother, Aaron Brown. After Brooks' parents viewed the site, they contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office on August 7, 1997. When investigator Michael Guerra accessed the website, he discovered numerous violent threats directed against the students and teachers of Columbine High School. He wrote an affidavit requesting a search warrant of the Harris household. The affidavit also mentioned the discovery of an exploded pipe bomb and a suspicion of Eric being involved in the unsolved case. However, the affidavit was never submitted to a judge and therefore went ignored. On January 30, 1998, Eric and Dillon were arrested for breaking into a van parked near Littleton and stealing tools and computer equipment. They would subsequently attend a court hearing where they would plead guilty to the felony of theft. The judge sentenced them to a juvenile diversion program. As a result, both of them attended mandatory classes such as anger management and talked with diversion officers. They were both eventually released from diversion several weeks early because of positive actions in the program, and they were put on probation. Nearly a year before the massacre, Dillon wrote a message in Eric's 1998 yearbook. "Killing enemies, blowing up stuff, killing cops. My wrath for January's incidents will be godlike. Not to mention, our revenge in the Commons." The Commons was another term for the school cafeteria. Both Eric and Dillon kept journals, which were released to the public in 2006. In the journals, the pair would eventually document their arsenal and plan of attack. Shortly after the court hearing for the van break-in, Eric reverted his website back to just posting about gaming. He began to write his thoughts down in a journal instead. It shows a long period of methodical preparation for the massacre. Eric also typed out on his computer a plan for the attack, which includes possibly escaping to a foreign country afterwards, or hijacking an aircraft at Denver International Airport and crashing it into New York City. Dillon had already been writing down his thoughts since March 1997. As early as November 1997, Dillon mentioned going on a killing spree. Eric and Dillon also used their schoolwork to foreshadow the massacre. They both displayed themes of violence in their creative writing projects. In December 1997, Eric wrote a paper on school shootings titled "Guns in Schools" and a poem from the perspective of a bullet. Dillon wrote a short story about a man killing students, which worried his teacher so much that she alerted his parents. On October 2nd, 1997, Eric and Dillon were suspended for hacking into Columbine High School's computer system to get student locker combinations. Both of them also actively researched war and murder. For one project, Eric wrote a paper on Nazis, and Dillon wrote a paper on Charles Manson. In a psychology class, Eric wrote he dreamed of going on a shooting spree with Dillon. Eric and Dillon were both enrolled in a video production class and kept 5 videotapes that were recorded with school video equipment. Only 2 of these, Hitman for Hire and Rampart Rage, and a third known as Radioactive Clothing, have been released to the public. The remaining 3 tapes detail their plans and reasons for the massacre, including the ways they hid their weapons and deceived their parents. Most of these were shot in the Harris family basement, and thus are known as the basement tapes. 30 minutes before the attack, they made a final video saying goodbye and apologizing to their friends and families. In December 1999, before anyone else had seen them, Time magazine published an article on these tapes. The victims' family members threatened to sue Jefferson County, also known as Jeffco, and as a result, select victims' families and journalists were allowed to see them, and they were kept from the public indefinitely for fear of inspiring future massacres. The tapes have since been destroyed. There are only transcripts of some of the dialogue and a short clip recorded surreptitiously by the victim's father. The pair claimed they were going to make copies of the tapes and send them to the news stations, but never did so. When an economics class had Eric make an ad for a business, he and Dillon made a video called Hitman for Hire on December 8th, 1998, which was released to the public in February 2004. It depicts them as part of the Trench Coat Mafia, a clique in the school who wore black trench coats and extorted money for protecting kids from bullies. They were apparently not a part of the Trench Coat Mafia, but were friends with some of its members. They wore black trench coats on the day of the massacre, and the video seemed like some kind of a dress rehearsal, showing them walking down the halls and shooting bullies outside with fake guns. Eric and Dylan were unable to legally purchase firearms due to them both being underage at the time. Dylan then enlisted Robin Anderson, an 18-year-old Columbine student and an old friend of Dylan's, to make a straw purchase of 2 shotguns and a high-point carbine for the pair. In exchange for her cooperation with the investigation that followed the shootings, no charges were filed against her. The shooters also possessed a semi-automatic handgun, which had a long history. The manufacturer of the handgun first sold it to Miami-based Navigar Incorporated. It was then sold to Zander Sporting Goods in Baldwin, Illinois in 1994. The gun was later sold to Thornton, Colorado arms dealer Larry Russell. In violation of federal law, Russell failed to keep records of the sale, yet he determined that the purchase of the gun was 21 years of age or older. 2 men, Mark Manns and Philip Duran, were convicted of supplying weapons for the two. The bombs used by the pair varied and were crudely made from carbon dioxide canisters, galvanized pipe, and metal propane bottles. The bombs were primed with matches, placed at one end. Both had striker tips on their sleeves. When they rubbed against the bomb, the match head would light the fuse. The weekend before the shootings, Eric and Dylan had purchased propane tanks and other supplies from a hardware store for a few $100s. Several residents of the area claimed to have heard glass breaking and buzzing sounds from the Harris's family garage, which was later concluded to indicate that they were constructing the pipe bombs. The massacre took place on April 20th, 1999, just weeks before Eric and Dylan were both due to graduate. As Eric pulled into the parking lot, he encountered classmate Brooks Brown, who was smoking a cigarette outside during his lunch break. Brooks had severed his friendship with Eric a year earlier after Eric had thrown a chunk of ice at his car windshield, but Brooks reconciled with Eric just prior to the shooting. Brooks approached Eric near his car and scolded him for skipping his morning classes, because Eric was always very serious about schoolwork and being on time. Eric replied, "It doesn't matter anymore." Eric followed up a few seconds later, "Brooks, I like you. Get out of here. Go home." Brooks, feeling uneasy, and already prepared to skip his next class, walked away down South Pierce Street. Meanwhile, Dylan had arrived at the school in a separate car. Eric and Dylan armed themselves, using straps and webbing to conceal weapons beneath black trench coats. They lugged backpacks and duffel bags that were filled with pipe bombs and ammunition. Eric also had a shotgun in one of the bags. Beneath their coats, Eric wore a homemade bandoiler and a white t-shirt that read "Natural Selection" in black letters. Dylan wore a black t-shirt that read "Wrath" in red letters. The cafeteria bombs failed to detonate. Had these bombs exploded with full power, they could have killed or severely wounded all of the 488 students in the cafeteria, and possibly made the ceilings collapse by destroying the pillars holding it up, dropping the library into the cafeteria. Their original plans indicated that when these bombs detonated, Eric and Dylan would be camped out by their cars and shoot, stab, and throw bombs at survivors of the initial explosion as they ran out of the school. But when these devices failed to detonate, Eric and Dylan launched a shooting attack against their classmates and teachers. It was the deadliest attack ever perpetrated at an American high school until the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting on February 14, 2018. At 11:19 a.m., 17-year-old Rachel Scott and her friend Richard Castaldo were having lunch sitting on the grass next to the west entrance of the school. Dylan threw a pipe bomb towards the parking lot. The bomb only partially detonated, causing it to give off smoke. Richard thought it was no more than a crude senior prank. Likewise, several students during the incident first thought that they were watching a prank. A witness reported hearing "go, go" before Eric and Dylan pulled their guns from beneath their coats and began shooting. Rachel was killed instantly when she was hit 4 times, with rounds fired from Eric's carbine. 1 shot was to the left temple. Richard was shot 8 times in the chest, arm, and abdomen. He fell unconscious to the ground and was left paralyzed below the chest. Eric aimed his gun down the west staircase in the direction of 3 students, Daniel, Sean, and Lance. The students figured they were paintball guns, and they were about to walk up the staircase directly below the shooters. Eric fired, killing Daniel while injuring Sean and Lance. Dave Sanders, a teacher and coach at the school, was in the cafeteria when he heard the gunfire and began warning students. The shooters turned and began firing west in the direction of 5 students sitting on the grassy hillside adjacent to the steps and opposite the west entrance of the school. Michael Johnson was hit in the face, leg, and arm, but managed to run and escape. Mark Taylor was shot in the chest, arms, and leg and fell to the ground, where he faked his death. The other 3 escaped, uninjured. Dylan walked down the steps towards the cafeteria. He came up to Lance, who was already wounded and lying on the ground calling for help. Dylan said, "Sure, I'll help you," then shot him in the face with his shotgun. Although gravely injured, Lance would survive. Sean, who had been paralyzed beneath the waist, had crawled to the doorway of the cafeteria's west entrance and collapsed. He rubbed blood in his face and played dead. After shooting Lance, Dylan walked towards the cafeteria door. He then stepped over the injured Sean to enter the cafeteria. Sean remembers Dylan saying, "Sorry, dude." Dylan only briefly entered the cafeteria and did not shoot at the several people still inside. Officials speculated that Dylan went back to check on the propane bombs. Eric was still at the top of the stairs shooting, severely wounding and partially paralyzing 17-year-old Anne-Marie as she tried to flee. Dylan came out of the cafeteria and went back up the stairs to join Eric. They shot at students standing close to a soccer field, but didn't hit anyone. They walked over to the west entrance, throwing pipe bombs in several directions, including onto the roof. Only a few of these pipe bombs detonated. Witnesses heard one of them say, "This is what we always wanted to do. This is awesome." Meanwhile, art teacher Patty Nielsen was inside the school. She had noticed the commotion and walked towards the west entrance with student Brian Anderson. Patty had intended to walk outside and to tell the 2 students to knock it off, thinking they were either filming a video or pulling a student prank. As Brian Anderson opened the first set of double doors, the gunman shot out the windows, injuring him with flying glass. Patty was hit in the shoulder with shrapnel. Brian and Patty ran back down the hall towards the library, and Patty alerted the students inside to the danger, telling them to get under the desks and to keep silent. She dialed 911 and hid under the library's administrative counter. Brian fell to the floor, bleeding from his injuries. He then hid inside the magazine room adjacent to the library. At 11:22, a custodian called Deputy Neil Gardner, the assigned resource officer to Columbine, heard on the school radio someone requesting assistance in the senior parking lot. The only paved route took him around the school to the east and south on Pierce Street, where at 11:23 a.m. he heard on his police radio that a female was down and assumed that she had been struck by a car. While exiting his patrol car in the senior lot at 11:24, he heard another call on the school radio. "Neil, there's a shooter in the school." Eric, at the west entrance, immediately turned and fired 10 shots from his carbine at Neil, who was 60 yards away. As Eric reloaded his gun, Neil leaned over the top of his car and fired 4 rounds at Eric from his service pistol. Eric ducked back behind the building, and Neil momentarily believed that he had hit him. Eric then re-emerged and fired at least 4 more rounds at Neil, which missed and 2 struck parked cars, before retreating into the building. No one was hit during the exchange of gunfire. Neil reported on his police radio, "Shots in the building. I need someone in the south lot with me." By this point, Eric had shot 47 times, and Dylan just 5. The shooters then entered the school through the west entrance, moving along the main north hallway, throwing pipe bombs and shooting at anyone they encountered. Dylan shot Stephanie Munson in the ankle, but she was able to walk out of the school. The pair then shot out the windows to the east entrance of the school. After proceeding through the hall several times and shooting towards and missing any students they saw, they went towards the west entrance and turned into the library hallway. Deputies Paul Smoker and Paul Magner, motorcycle patrolmen for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, were writing a traffic ticket north of the school when the female down call came in at 11:23 a.m. Taking the shortest route, they drove their motorcycles over the grass between the athletic fields and headed towards the west entrance. When they saw 3 deputies following them in their patrol car, they abandoned their motorcycles for the safety of the car. The 6 deputies had begun to rescue 2 wounded students near the ball fields when another gunfight broke out at 11:26, as Eric returned to the double doors again and began shooting at Deputy Neil Gardner, who returned fire. From the hilltop, Deputy Smoker fired 3 rounds from his pistol at Eric, who again retreated into the building. As before, no one was hit. Inside the school cafeteria, Dave Sanders and 2 custodians, John Curtis and Jay Galantine, initially told students to get under the tables, then successfully evacuated students up the staircase leading to the 2nd floor of the school. The stairs were located around the corner from the library hallway, in the main south hallway. Dave Sanders then tried to secure as much of the school as he could. By now, Eric and Dylan were inside the main hallway. Dave Sanders and another student were down at the end of one hallway when he gestured for students in the library to stay. They encountered Eric and Dylan, who were approaching from the corner of the north hallway. Derek and the student turned and ran in the opposite direction. Eric shot at them both, with Eric hitting Dave twice in the back and neck, hitting his teeth on exit. The student ran into the science classroom and warned everyone to hide. Dylan walked over towards Dave, who had collapsed, and tossed a pipe bomb, then returned to Eric up the library hallway. Dave struggled towards the science area, and a teacher took him into a classroom where 30 students were located. Due to his knowledge of first aid, student Aaron Hansey was brought to the classroom from a neighbouring classroom. With the assistance of a fellow student named Kevin Starkey and teacher Teresa Miller, Aaron Hansey administered first aid to Dave for 3 hours. Attempting to stem the blood loss using shirts from students in the room and showing him pictures from his wallet to keep him talking. Using a phone in the room, Teresa Miller and several students maintained contact with police outside of the school. At 11:29 a.m., Eric and Dylan entered the library. 52 students, 2 teachers, and 2 librarians were inside. Eric fired his shotgun twice at a desk. Student Evan Todd had been standing near a pillar when the shooters entered, and he had just taken cover behind a copier. Evan Todd was hit by wood splinters in the eye and lower back, but was not seriously injured. He then hid behind the administrative counter. The gunman walked into the library towards 2 rows of computers. Sitting at the north row was disabled student Kyle Velasquez. Dylan fired his shotgun, fatally hitting him in the head and back. They put down their ammunition-filled duffel bags at the lower row of computers and reloaded their weapons. They then walked between the rows of computers towards the windows facing the outside staircase. Throughout the massacre in the library, they ordered everyone to get up, saying that the library was going to explode. They stated how long they had been waiting for this, and they seemed to be enjoying themselves, shouting things like, "Yahoo!" after shooting. While ordering the jocks to stand up, one of the 2 said, "Anyone with a white hat or a sports emblem is dead." Wearing a white baseball cap at Columbine was a tradition among sports team members. Nobody stood up, and several students tried to hide their white hats. Windows were shot out in the direction of the recently arrived police. Officers returned fire, and the gunman retreated from the windows. No one was injured. Dylan removed his trench coat. He then fired his shotgun at a nearby table, injuring 3 students: Patrick Ireland, Daniel Stapleton, and Mackay Hall. Eric walked towards the lower row of computer desks with his shotgun and fired a single shot under the first desk while down on his knees. He hit 14-year-old Stephen Curnow with a mortal wound to the neck. He then moved to the adjacent computer desk, injuring 17-year-old Casey with a shot which passed completely through her right shoulder, also grazing her neck and severing a major artery. When she started gasping in pain, Eric stated, "Quit your bitching." Eric then walked to a table south of the computers with 2 students underneath, Cassie Bernal and Emily Wyant. Eric slapped the surface of the table twice as he knelt and said peekaboo before shooting Cassie once in the head with the shotgun and killing her. Eric held the gun with one hand at this point, and the weapon hit his face in recoil, injuring his nose. He told Dylan what happened, and Dylan angrily responded, "Why'd you do that?" After fatally shooting Cassie, Eric turned towards the next table, where Bree sat next to the table rather than under it. Eric's nose was bleeding. Witnesses later reported that he had blood around his mouth. Eric asked Bree if she wanted to die, and she responded with a plea for her life. Eric laughed and responded, "Everyone's gonna die." When Dylan said, "Shoot her," Eric responded, "No, we're gonna blow up the school anyways." Dylan noticed Patrick trying to provide aid to Mackay, who had suffered a wound to his knee. As Patrick tried to help Mackay, his head rose above the table. Dylan shot him a second time, hitting him twice in the head and once in the foot. Patrick was knocked unconscious, but survived. Dylan then walked over to another table, where he discovered 18-year-old Isaiah Scholes, 16-year-old Matthew Ketcher, and 16-year-old Craig Scott hiding underneath. Dylan called out to Eric that he had found a N-word and tried to pull Isaiah Scholes out from under the table. Harris left Bree and joined him. According to witnesses, they taunted Isaiah for a few seconds, making derogatory racial comments. The gunmen both fired under the table. Eric shot Isaiah once in the chest, killing him, and Dylan shot and killed Matthew Ketcher. Though Isaiah was not shot in the head, Dylan said, "I didn't know that black brains could fly that far." Meanwhile, Scott was uninjured, lying in the blood of his friends, feigning death. Eric then yelled, "Who's ready to die next?" He turned and threw a bomb at a table where Mackay, Daniel, and Patrick were located. It landed on Daniel's thigh. Mackay quickly noticed it and tossed it behind them, and it exploded in midair. Eric walked towards the bookcases between the west and center section of tables in the library. He jumped on one and shook it, apparently attempting to topple it, then shot at the books which had fallen. Dylan shot at a display case next to the door, then turned and shot towards the closest table, hitting and injuring 17-year-old Mark in the head and shoulder. He then turned towards the table to his left and fired, injuring 18-year-old Lisa Kreutz, Lauren Townsend, and Valine Schnur, with the same shotgun blast. Moving closer to the table, he fired several shots, killing Lauren Townsend. At this point, the seriously injured Valine began screaming, "Oh my God, oh my God." In response, Dylan asked her if she believed in the existence of God. When Valine said that she did, Dylan asked why, and commented, "God is gay." Dylan reloaded, but walked away from the table. Eric approached another table where 2 girls were hiding. He bent down to look at them and dismissed them as pathetic. Eric then moved to another table where he fired twice, injuring 17-year-old Nicole Nolan and John Timlin. John moved out from under the table. Dylan shot him repeatedly, killing him. Eric then walked back over to the other side of the table where Lauren Townsend lay dead. Behind the table, a 16-year-old girl named Kelly Fleming had, like Bree, sat next to the table rather than beneath it due to lack of space. Eric shot her with his shotgun, hitting her in the back and killing her. He shot at the table behind Kelly, hitting Lauren Townsend, who was already dead. The shot also hit Lisa Kreutz again and wounded 18-year-old Gianna Park. The shooters moved to the center of the library, where they reloaded their weapons at a table. Eric then pointed his carbine under a table, but the student he was aiming at moved out of the way. Eric turned his gun back on the student and told him to identify himself. It was John Savage, an acquaintance of Dylan's. He asked Dylan what they were doing, to which he shrugged and answered, "Killing people." John asked if they were going to kill him. Dylan said, "What?" John asked again whether they were going to kill him. Dylan said no and told him to run. John fled, escaping through the library's main entrance. After John left, Eric turned and fired his gun at the table directly north of where he had been, hitting the ear and hand of 15-year-old Daniel Mauser. Daniel reacted by either shoving a chair at Eric or grabbing his leg. Eric fired again and hit Daniel in the center of his face at close range, killing him. Both shooters moved south and fired randomly under other tables, critically injuring two 17-year-olds, Jennifer Doyle and Austin Eubanks, and fatally wounding 17-year-old Corey DePuter. At 11:35, there were no further victims. They had killed 10 people in the library and wounded 12. At this point, Dylan was quoted saying that they might start knifing people, though they never did. They headed towards the library's main counter. Eric threw a Molotov cocktail towards the southwestern end of the library, but it failed to explode. They converged close to where Todd had moved after being wounded. Dylan pulled the chair out from under the desk. Then he pointed his gun at Todd, who was wearing a white hat. Dylan asked if he was a jock, and when Todd said no, Dylan responded with, "Well, that's good. We don't like jocks." Dylan then demanded to see his face. Todd partly lifted his hat, so his face would remain obscured. When Dylan asked Todd to give him one reason why he shouldn't kill him, Todd said, "I don't want trouble." Dylan responded back angrily, "Trouble? You don't even know what trouble is." Todd tried to correct himself. "That's not what I meant. I mean, I don't have a problem with you guys. I never will, and I never did." Dylan then told Eric he was going to let Todd live, but Eric could kill him if he wanted. Eric seemed to pay little attention and said, "Let's go to the commons." Dylan fired a single shot into an open library staff break room, hitting a small television. While Eric was walking away, Dylan said, "One more thing," then picked up a chair beside the library counter under which Patty Nielsen was hiding, and slammed the chair down on top of the computer terminal and library counter. Dylan joined Eric at the library entrance. The two walked out of the library at 11:36. Cautiously, fearing the shooter's return, 10 injured and 29 uninjured survivors began to evacuate the library through the north emergency exit door, which led down to the sidewalk adjacent to the west entrance. Casey was evacuated from the library by Craig Scott. Had she not have been evacuated at this point, Casey would have likely bled to death from her injuries. Patrick Ireland, unconscious, and Lisa Kreutz, unable to move, remained in the building. Patty Nielsen crawled to the exterior break room, into which Dylan had earlier fired shots, and hid in a cupboard. After leaving the library, Eric and Dylan entered the science area, where they caused a fire in an empty storage closet. It was extinguished by a teacher who had hidden in an adjacent room. The gunmen then proceeded towards the south hallway, where they shot into an empty science room. At 11:44 a.m., they were captured on the school's CCTV as they re-entered the cafeteria. The recording shows Eric kneeling on the landing and firing a single shot towards one of the propane bombs that was left in the cafeteria. It was an unsuccessful attempt to detonate the bomb. Dylan approached one of the propane bombs and examined it. Eric took a drink from one of the cups left behind. Dylan lit a Molotov cocktail and threw it at the propane bomb. About a minute later, the gallon of fuel attached to the bomb ignited, causing a fire that was extinguished by the fire sprinklers a few minutes later. They left the cafeteria at 11:46. After leaving, they returned to the main north and south hallways of the school and fired several shots into walls and ceilings as students and teachers hid in rooms. They walked through the south hallway to the main office before returning to the north hallway. At 11:56, they returned to the cafeteria and briefly entered the school kitchen. They returned up the staircase and into the south hallway at 12 p.m. They re-entered the library, which was empty of survivors except for the unconscious Patrick and injured Lisa. Once inside, at 12:02, police were shot at again through the library windows and returned fire. nobody was injured in the exchange. By 12:05, all gunfire from the school had ceased. By 12:08, the gunmen had killed themselves. Eric sat down with his back to a bookshelf and fired his shotgun through the roof of his mouth. Dylan went down at his knees and shot himself in the left temple. An article by the Rocky Mountain News stated that Patty Nielsen overheard them shout, 1, 2, 3, in unison, just before a loud boom. However, Patty Nielsen claimed that she had never spoken with either of the writers of the article. In 2002, the National Enquirer published 2 post-mortem photos of Eric and Dylan in the library. Dylan's gun was underneath his body and is so unseen in the photo, leading to speculation that Eric shot Dylan before killing himself. However, some of Dylan's blood was on Eric's legs. Also, just before shooting himself, Dylan lit a Molotov cocktail at a nearby table, underneath which Patrick Ireland was laying, which caused the tabletop to momentarily catch fire. Underneath the scorched film of material was a piece of Eric's brain matter, suggesting Eric had shot himself by this point. On the morning of April 21st, one day after the attack, bomb squads combed the high school. By 8:30 a.m., the official death toll of 15 was released. The total death count was 12 students, 14 including the shooters, and 1 teacher. 20 students and 1 teacher were injured as a result of the shootings. 3 more victims were injured indirectly as they tried to escape the school. It was then known as the worst school shooting in U.S. history. At 12 a.m., the bomb squad declared the building safe for officials to enter. By 11:30 a.m., a spokesman of the sheriff declared the investigation underway. 13 of the bodies were still inside the high school as investigators photographed the building. At 2:30 p.m., a press conference was held by Jeffco District Attorney David Thomas and Sheriff John Stone, at which they said they suspected others had helped plan the shooting. Formal identification of the dead had not yet taken place, but the families of the children thought to have been killed had been notified. Throughout the late afternoon and early evening, the bodies were gradually removed from the school and taken to the coroner's office to be identified and autopsied. By 5 p.m., the names of many of the dead were known. An official statement was released, naming the 15 confirmed deaths and 27 injuries related to the massacre. On April 22nd, the cafeteria bombs were discovered. In the days following the shootings, Rachel Scott's car and John Timlin's truck became memorials, and impromptu memorials were held in Clement Park. On April 30th, carpenter Greg Zanis erected 15 6-foot-tall wooden crosses to honor those who had died at the school. A victim's father cut down the 2 meant for the gunmen. There were also 15 trees planted, and he cut down 2 of those as well. In 2000, youth advocate Melissa Helmbrecht organized a remembrance event in Denver featuring surviving students called A Call to Help. The library where most of the massacre took place was removed and replaced with an atrium. In 2001, a new library, the Hope Memorial Library, was built next to the west entrance. On February 26, 2004, thousands of pieces of evidence from the massacre were put on display at the Jeffco Fairgrounds in Golden. A permanent memorial to honor and remember the victims of the April 20th, 1999 shootings at Columbine High School began planning in June 1999 and was dedicated on September 21, 2007 in Clement Park. The Memorial Fund raised $1.5 million in donations over 8 years of planning. Designing took over 3.5 years and included feedback from victims' families, survivors, and the high school students and staff and the community. Following the Columbine shooting, schools across the United States instituted new security measures, such as see-through backpacks, metal detectors, school uniforms, and security guards. Some schools implemented the numbering of school doors in order to improve public safety response. Several schools throughout the country resorted to requiring students to wear computer-generated IDs. Schools also adopted a zero-tolerance approach to possession of weapons and threatening behavior by students. Despite the effort, several social science experts feel the zero-tolerance approach adopted in schools has been implemented too harshly, with unintended consequences creating other problems. Despite the safety measures that were implemented in the wake of the tragedy at Columbine, school shootings continue to take place in the United States, including the shootings at Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, and Stoneman Douglas. Some schools renewed existing anti-bullying policies. Rachel's Challenge was started by Rachel Scott's parents and lectures schools about bullying and suicide. The shooting also resulted in calls for more gun control measures. The gun show loophole and background checks became a focus of a national debate. It was the deadliest mass shooting during the era of the federal assault weapons ban. Victim Daniel Mauser's father, Tom Mauser, had become a gun control advocate. In 2000, federal and state legislation was introduced that would require safety locks on firearms as well as a ban on the importation of high-capacity ammunition magazines. Though laws were passed that made it a crime to buy guns for criminals and minors, there was considerable controversy over legislation pertaining to background checks at gun shows. There was concern in the gun lobby over restrictions on Second Amendment rights in the United States. Frank Lautenberg introduced a proposal to close the gun show loophole in federal law. It was passed in the Senate, but it did not pass in the House. Michael Moore's 2002 documentary, Bowling for Columbine, focused heavily on the American obsession with handguns, its grip on Jefferson County, and its role in the shooting. In 2009, the My Last Shot project was launched by a student-led gun violence prevention resource. The campaign was created by students from Columbine High School and involved students placing stickers on their driver's license, student IDs, or phones that states their wishes to have the graphic photos of their bodies publicized if they die in a shooting. And that is it for tonight's episode. This is an absolutely insane case. I remember I first heard about it when I watched Bowling for Columbine. Whenever this was happening, I was very young and I was living in England, I believe, so I wouldn't have heard about it. But through Michael Moore's documentary Bowling for Columbine, I heard about the shooting and I kind of learned more about this sick culture of school shootings in America. And since then, growing up, I remember hearing about the Sandy Hook school shooting and most recently the Stoneman Douglas one. And moving out of the school shootings kind of arena, even just recently in Colorado, there was a shooting in a grocery store. And for someone who, I live in Ireland, so we don't have like access to weapons here. I don't believe. I think you can get a weapon for hunting, but mass shootings are just something that doesn't happen here. When we were in school, what we would have drills for would basically just be for fires. We'd have like a fire drill, but to hear that some children and teenagers have to have active shooter drills is deeply disturbing. For people to kind of put their Second Amendment before the safety of children and any of these people that have suffered and died in these mass shootings with these assault weapons, nobody needs to own an AK-47. Like a normal person doesn't need a military weapon. I get it if you feel like you want to own a handgun or some kind of arms to protect yourself, but these high capacity guns aren't really necessary for a civilian to have. A lot has happened since Columbine, but it seems like these shootings in America may continue, just because it seems like a lot of people don't really want to give up their Second Amendment or whatever that means to them. If you have any insight on this case, I would love to hear it. You can always get in touch with me on Instagram. It's just something.dark.podcast. I want to say thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next week.